This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hello there, welcome to the show. I missed last week, but this week I'm not under the weather, and I'm happy to reunite with my friend Eric Peters from Eric Peters Autos. Eric, how are you today?
I'm in a good mood today for two reasons. One, I've been enjoying watching Afro Man videos, and two, I've got my Trans Am running again.
That's actually where I wanted to start today.
Yeah.
I thought we could begin on a high note. Bring us up to speed. How is your project going?
Well, the last conundrum was overcome. I thought that I was going to be able to start the car last Friday because I'd had everything installed and I double checked twice and looked at it, got the battery reconnected, turned the ignition key. Remember when you had to do that instead of pushing the button? Turned the ignition key, and instead of hearing the engine roar to life, I heard the starter grinding.
Oh no.
Yeah, and for those who haven't had to deal with this before, the starter has a little pinion that comes out when you key the ignition, and that pinion gear engages the flywheel, and that's what causes the engine to turn and start. Well, it's important that those two things be lined up correctly. And I just assumed, and here's another case study of never assume anything. I assumed that since the starter that had been installed previously didn't need to have shims, that it would just work without having to be shimmed with the new flywheel. But apparently the new flywheel was slightly different than the original automatic flex plate. And as a result of that, I had gears grinding. Now, the thing of it is, if I had a brain in my head, I would have checked the relationship when the transmission and bell housing were not in the car, because then I could have sat behind the engine and seen the flywheel, seen the starter, and observed the relationship, and made the adjustment much more readily and easily. Instead, I had to crawl under the car with shims, which are just what they sound like, shims, and you have to lower the starter and slip these shims in to adjust the relationship of the starter relative to the flywheel. And it's just basically try it until you get it right. One shim might work, two might be too many. They come in different thicknesses, and you just have to experiment until you find the right relationship. Well, I finally did yesterday. Turned out I needed a thick shim and a thin shim. Put those two in there, and blammo, she started right up.
Nice. So have you taken it out then?
Not yet, because being paranoid, and I'm extra cautious, this is voice of experience, I have learned to not assume things. So I have checked the operation of the transmission with the rear wheels off the ground so as to not put any load on the driveline, just in case that there was something that wasn't quite right. Everything seemed to work perfectly properly, but I still want to get under the car one last time and have a look to see if anything's leaking, anything's at all not right before I put it down on the ground and take it out. And I'm hoping that I have time later today to do that.
Man, it's understandable though, looking at the time and money and effort that you have put into getting this project completed. I think you're smart to, scope it out from every possible angle. But man, I'm looking forward to seeing the video, because I'm sure you'll do one when you do take it out for that test drive.
Oh, yeah. And by the way, I think it's important to be patient and careful when you're doing any job, even if it's just something basic like an oil change. Don't rush. When you're in a hurry, that's when you make mistakes. Be methodical. Look at what you're doing. Make sure it's right. Oil changes. Make sure you actually put the oil in the engine. Sometimes people forget. Make sure you put enough oil in the engine. Make sure you didn't put too much oil in the engine. Check everything. And then when you start the car, don't assume that it's not leaking. Watch your oil pressure light or gauge, and maybe look under the car to see whether anything's dripping.
No, that sounds like sound advice. Well, I'm happy for you. And look, just in time for really expensive gas, which I'm sure is going to be a thrill. Just out of curiosity, what are you guys paying in your neck of the woods?
About $4. It's up about $1 versus before this war started. And I wrote an article the other day that I thought would be helpful in that it might get people to see exactly how much this war is costing them. And I used the example of an average vehicle, like a crossover SUV, not a big SUV, not a big truck. And these typically have about a 12 to 15 gallon tank, roughly. So if you're paying about $1 more for every gallon of gas, you're paying about $60 more per month for fuel right now. And over the course of a year, that's more than $700. That's a big tax increase to pay for this war that nobody asked for, nobody wanted, and which by any metric that I'm aware of was completely unnecessary. And the thing that people should understand is kind of like a tsunami. You know how the tsunami, the tide goes out. That's your first clue that something bad is going to happen. Takes a little while for the tide to come back in. Well, The tide that's going to come back in is what we're going to be paying at grocery stores soon because of the cost, not just of gasoline, but of diesel, because everything gets sent to stores and trucked and carried by diesel electric locomotives and by ships. And diesel now is well over $5 a gallon. So bet your bippy, we're going to be paying a lot more for food on top of paying more for gasoline.
And let's translate this into a couple other areas of life. Maybe with warmer weather coming, hey, we need to get our air conditioner serviced. Great. The guy who's going to come and see you, more likely than not, is going to be driving a diesel-powered rig. Guess what went up for him? His cost of doing business. And guess where that
Absolutely.
cost is going to go? You're going to be helping him pay for the cost of being out there and on the road. And I mean, it's just everything is going up. The crazy thing is, it's scary to some people. I made the mistake as I was having a nice lengthy drive with my wife. I was kind of griping about gas prices because we were gassing up, often enough, and um, I was just like, this is going to raise the cost of everything, exactly as you just said. And I should have been a little more aware, but finally, she just kind of snapped at me and was like, you know what, this is scaring me. And I went,
Mhm.
it
Well, yeah,
should
it's
be,
scary.
but that wasn't my purpose. But um, for people who are experiencing that little pang of fear, though, let me ask you, Eric, what's something productive we can do about this? We can sit and wring our hands, but um, there's got to be some kind of productive action we can take at the individual level, in spite of the decider in chief, continuing to drag us into something that I don't think very many of us want.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. It's one I've been pondering myself. What can we do? Well, I don't really know other than get ready because it's baked in now. Even if the war were to end today, the damage that's been done over there is so extensive, it's going to have effects and consequences that are going to echo for months, if not years. And we are going to be feeling much more pain very shortly, I believe. So it might be a smart, sensible thing to do to prepare a little bit for what might be coming, in terms of things like I try to be conscientious about keeping, I've got five-gallon jugs that I try to keep filled with gas. Not so much for the vehicles, but for the generator. Who knows? We may have civil unrest. We may have all sorts of chaos that we can't anticipate as a result of the things that are going on right now. Something practical, though, that did occur to me. Now, this is not a solution for everybody, obviously, but having a small motorcycle is a really good way to combat some of these fuel prices. You can get a 250cc dual sport motorcycle, used, I'm talking about, in good condition, in good mechanical condition for, around $2,500 or so. And these things get 90 to 100 miles per gallon. And if we are facing a situation where the cost of a gallon of gas goes up to $7 or $8, which is not unrealistic, that might be the only way to get anywhere. And now obviously you can't do it in winter, but at least for now, it's a way to still have viable transportation at your disposal. Excuse me.
I was looking at someone from Europe had weighed in about the cost per liter, which kind of throws people off, when it comes to buying gas over there. But you see the sign $2. Oh, $2, man, this is a
Yeah,
part per liter, which I think it said the price of gas now that would put it above $11 a gallon.
right. Can you imagine?
That's steep. I
I mean,
mean,
it essentially means that that's why they don't, most people over there, if you've been to Europe, you have, and you don't see big SUVs and trucks except if the government has them. And why? Well, a typical SUV with a V8 engine has about a 25-gallon fuel tank. If you're paying $11 for a gallon, I mean,
yeah.
it's just not, it's not feasible for people who aren't very affluent to be able to put $120 or $150 worth of fuel in their vehicle once a week.
Let me ask you something. I know as a general rule, EVs are not something that you recommend, and I think you actually have some very good reasons why. Electric bikes, though, for someone who lives in the suburbs or maybe even lives within, in town, um, I'm thinking maybe one of those e-bikes might not be a bad idea, unless you're, young and athletic and just can jump on a regular bicycle. But you have thoughts on those?
Well, yes and no. For short term, like if you have let's say you need to go 3 or 4 miles down the road, a distance that's a little bit too far to walk, and maybe if you're not athletic, you don't want to ride a bicycle that far. Sure, those things are an option. I wouldn't recommend putting it in your house though. They have a bad tendency to catch fire. even more so than electric vehicles. But yeah, I mean, if you can pick one up for cheap, and they are relatively inexpensive, and you can store it outside somewhere where somebody's not going to snatch it. Yeah, I mean, it's just another possible alternative.
Okay. Just was wondering. My wife actually has kind of been wanting one for a bit, but where we live, we're pretty far from town, and frankly, those county roads, especially when harvest
Yeah.
season comes, they're pretty hazardous with the big trucks.
Yep. I think a more viable thing is, if you can find them, they're getting scarce. But if you could find an old, actually economical car, something that was made in the late 90s, something like a Honda Civic CRX, something like a Geo Metro, something like a Mitsubishi Mirage, these are cars that got 50 miles per gallon or better. And they did it without hybrid technology. And it's a car. So, it's actually got space for passengers, space to carry things. And most importantly, it's secure from the elements. You've got doors
Yeah.
and windows. That's going to matter unless you happen to live in a very temperate area like Southern California or Florida.
There was a story I wanted to share with you. I'll send you a link to go along with this, but um, we have where I live in southern Idaho, we have a state senator, and she is exceptional in that she's very principled, cannot be bought, which has actually drawn some of the ire of some of the big agricultural industries, the Dairymen's Association and others. They are now pooling resources to try to primary her out of office, and it's over the issue of illegal immigration. Now, she's not, Tom Homan, let's round up everybody, and she's not necessarily part of that aggressive ICE thing, but about employers, you should not be knowingly hiring people who shouldn't be here in the first place, and we shouldn't be giving taxpayer-funded benefits to people who shouldn't be here in the first place. But the way that her primary opponent and the way that these agricultural interests have come after her was not directly at her, although the challenge in the primary is part of it. They gone after her husband, who sells um, industrial lubricants to the big, agricultural operations. And basically, I think three of the really big, and we're talking, multi-million dollar operations have said, we don't want him to be our rep, which effectively pulls the financial rug right out from under them. And I bring this up just because when we read about lives, fortunes, sacred honor, like the founders talked about in the Declaration of Independence, we kind of imagine that must have been hard. That must have been, wow, we're really firm about this. But at some point, there's actual skin in the game. Here's a modern example of what that looks like.
No, absolutely. If you read about the Revolutionary period in colonial America, the majority of Americans at that time, who weren't quite yet Americans, were Tories, meaning they backed the British government. They were kind of like Ned Beatty in Deliverance, who said, "Look, we don't want any trouble here." It took great courage to be a so-called rebel, as they were viewed by the British Crown at the time, to, as you say, put forth not just your honor, but potentially your life in the balance. Because if things had not gone well for people like Jefferson and Washington, they would have been hanged as traitors to the crown. They literally put everything they had on the chopping block, and that's what it takes. And that's what it's going to take now. Unfortunately, nobody wants to be the first guy to step out of the trench and run across no man's land into the field of fire. But at some point, somebody's got to do it. And I salute those who are willing to do that sort of thing. And I also wanted to add to your point, it gets my back up, as I think it does yours, these giant corporations and interests that want to exploit the illegal labor and offload the costs onto the community. That's the key thing. They want to pay these people very little money and give them very little benefits. And then the children of those people, they're going to use the local schools. They're going to, require health care and all of that. And so you and I get to pay high property taxes and all these other things to subsidize that, while these big corporations get fat and happy off of the proceeds.
Well, and it also brings to light that disconnect that I think people are seeing in many places. I see this in Idaho, certainly, where the state government, which exists for the purpose of protecting our rights and making sure that justice prevails, when a harm has occurred, instead of representing the people, though, it more and more is representing its corporate sponsors and those who have the deep pockets to keep, campaign funds flowing and lobbying efforts and so forth. I'm not sure that all that many voters pick up on that when they're standing in the booth, but there's a very real divide, and it's becoming more and more clear that more and more state government appears to govern on behalf of the donor class and less on behalf of the actual people that they're supposed to be out there representing.
Yeah, well, I think that there's pervasive cynicism now, and that cynicism is based on reality, on an understanding that that is precisely what the situation is. This whole notion of public service really ought to be just that, i.e., not for profit.
Yep.
I think that there's a case to be made that people ought not to be able to profit in some way at all from being involved with business that has to do with the business of government. I don't know exactly how you flesh that out, but surely there are ways to flesh that out. And this revolving door business, you should perhaps be disqualified from being in charge of a regulatory body if you have ever worked for the industry that you're going to regulate. And should be perhaps prohibited from ever working for that industry for profit after you leave service as a government regulator of that particular business.
Yep. It's hard to see, this happening, but I really think that every one of us, whether you're into politics or not, you've got a decision to make from the standpoint of, do you continue to give your consent? Do you continue to go along with it? This was one of the conversations that was also happening with my wife on our last trip was, you know, there there's a really good chance that all of the momentum we were feeling this time last year has not only dissipated but is now in reverse.
Yeah.
And I just said, if the Democrats sweep the midterms, the Republicans deserve to lose because they had it. They had it in their hands and then turned around and betrayed their base.
Yeah.
And it sparked a discussion of, well, what's the right thing to do? Do we continue to go with the ones who at least are trying to slow the roll of tyranny, or do we go with the ones who have just flat out said, we'll round up everybody we can and prosecute them when we get back in power? Um, I don't know about you. I'd rather face an enemy who's being upfront about what they're doing than one who's sticking a knife in my back while telling me, no, really, I'm on your side.
I would too. And in particular, I am tired of cowards and hypocrites. You remember a year ago, or well, during the 2024 election, when people on our side of the aisle, putatively, were pointing out how the people on the left were unwilling to acknowledge that Joe Biden was clearly senescent, clearly somebody who should no longer be in the position that he's in. And the Democrats wouldn't acknowledge it until the very last minute, and then they shoved Kamala Harris in there. Well, we're kind of at the same point now with Trump, in my opinion. There's almost nobody within the federal government or within the Republican Party apparat, except for Joe Kent, who is saying, this has got to stop. This is out of hand. And if we don't do something about it, we're all going to drown. This is not just about Trump. It's about all of us. All I can see is that Trump is single-handedly, completely shredding everything that MAGA was once supposedly about. And he's casting it into disrepute. And I foresee, as you do, if things don't change radically in another direction very soon, that the Democrats are going to sweep the midterms. And that's it. And it's over at that point.
And recognizing that possibility is not the same thing as cheering for it and yay, good. It's not a matter of at least I'll speak for myself, but I think we're on the same page here. We're not calling people, you don't hate Donald Trump enough. There's enough people out there who do. I think that we're stocked up pretty well. But the sense of betrayal is real. And the actual betrayal that has taken place, I think, is also real. And again, this brings it back to the individual level. At what point do you decide, I can't go along with this? I can't give my consent to something that I know is turning around and betraying me.
Yep. And horrible precedents are being set now that will be exploited by whoever the next president is. This idea that on his just gut say so, he can take the nation to war whenever he feels like it, with potentially disastrous repercussions for the country. There's a whole litany of things that Trump has done that have set horrendous precedents. This business of having these ICE goons all over American cities and now at the airports, it's a horrendous precedent that will be used and exploited by the next Democrat/leftist that becomes the president. And it's something that really ought to concern us mightily. And we still have a chance perhaps to do something about it. And if we don't, well, then, we're complicit in it.
Yeah, you mentioned Joe Kent, and I think this is probably a good example for us to end today's program on. This is a guy who nobody can say, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, he had what, 11 different combat tours, and his wife was killed in Syria. She was a naval intelligence officer. Um,
He was
and he
directly under
resigned.
Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, he was in a position to have access to all of the intel about what the Iranians were actually doing, as opposed to what Trump says they were doing.
Yeah, and he chose to walk away from it. And I know Mark Levin interviewed him yesterday on his show, and if you ever thought Levin was a control freak, wow, did it come out? You're speaking too fast. Slow down. Now I need you to be very, very clear on the. He wouldn't even let him get a word in, and as soon as he started making sense, oh, we got to go to a break. It's just every
Yep.
dodging tactic. But one of the things that came out in that interview was Joe Kent, was asked, well, why did you resign? Did you just do this so you could go out and grift, and make money? And he's like, I resigned so I could speak freely.
Right.
And I thought, ooh, I hope people will listen.
Right. People have pointed out things that Kent has said and done in the past that perhaps they don't agree with or don't like, and that may even have been wrong. Well, absolutely. There are things that people can point to that I've said and done in the past that were not necessarily the right thing to have done or said at the time. The thing that makes us not awful people is acknowledging perhaps that we made a mistake and trying not to make the same mistake. And if you're faced with a crucible decision like this, that you make the right decision. And when you do, we should applaud people who make the right decision, even if they have made bad decisions sometimes in the past. One of the things about Trump that's so galling is that he never, to my knowledge, has said, yep, I shouldn't have done that. That was a mistake. I won't do it again.
Yep. Well, unfortunately, we're up against the end of the segment, but as always, I feel better for having spoken with you.
Likewise.
Eric, thanks so much. Looking forward to next week's conversation.
Sounds good, Bryan.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.